All right, so good morning, everyone. My name is Slobodan Sudaric. I work with C-Labs, and I work to talk a little bit about tokenized natural capital assets and their use in regenerative finance, and tie this a little bit together in the context of the Mento protocol that Sochi also mentioned before for those who attended her talk. So let's maybe start a bit with some basics, what exactly we mean with ReFi or regenerative finance, because I think there are a couple of definitions floating around, and I really like this description by Peggy McCormick from Not Boring, which describes it a little bit in terms of pricing externalities in. So, charging those who create negative externalities and rewarding those who create positive externalities. And the question then comes up, what does this really mean translated to Web3 and blockchain more broadly? Because there is a very narrow view, I would say, to look at this. For example, we could ask ourselves, should we only care about like emissions of the underlying blockchain layer? And if yes, I think we already made some good progress there by moving away from, let's say, energy-intensive proof of work mechanisms towards, let's say, something like proof of stake. And something like Celo blockchain, I guess, made even one step more in that direction by taking this concept of externality serious and by including protocol level offsets, actually. The more broader view is, should we actually do more than that? And this chart here is a bit of an apples and oranges comparison, I have to admit, but I think it kind of brings across the point, because what you see here is in blue the Ethereum DeFi TVL total over the last 3 years, and in red you essentially see the global voluntary carbon market. And the question is, can't we channel a bit of the blue stuff into the red stuff, right? And the next question, if we agree that this makes sense and this is a use case for Web3, the next question is essentially, how can we actually do this? And this is where I want to talk a little bit about Mento protocol. So as Sochi already said, Celo is this layer 1 essentially with a focus on financial inclusion and sustainability, and Mento is a stability platform that is built on Celo that essentially creates currencies that support Celo's mission in achieving this. There are currently 3 currencies supported by Mento. One is a euro tracking stable asset, one is a dollar tracking, and one tracking the Brazilian real. And they were used in use cases all across the world, in humanitarian relief in Haiti and in the Philippines, and in microwork projects, for example, in Kenya. I don't really want to go into too much details, but just to give you like a rough understanding of how Mento works. So those stable assets are backed by an over-collateralized reserve that is on-chain. This reserve is essentially a basket of different crypto assets. So it includes Celo, it includes BTC, it includes ETH, it includes other stable assets for diversification purposes like USDC and DAI. And it also includes a small portion that you see on the top there of natural capital. And this part of natural capital is what I want to focus a little bit more now on. So the idea is really, if we look at historical currencies, what we can observe is that whatever was used essentially as a currency or whatever backed a currency, people tended to make more of. So when we use T-bricks, there was an overproduction of T-bricks. When cattle was used as a currency, there was an overproduction of cattle. When gold-backed currencies, everyone rushed into gold mining, essentially. So the idea is, can't we use the same logic, the same mechanism, but actually, back currencies with something that we would actually like to see more of? Clean water, unpolluted air, or beautiful forests. And this is essentially where this allocation comes into play. So the mechanism is then quite straightforward. So as more use cases for Mento stable assets emerge, more capital would flow into that reserve. And as the reserve grows in size, also the allocation towards natural capital would grow in size. And the reserve would essentially create additional and incremental demand for natural capital assets. And this in turn would then, translate into impact in the real world by creating capital flow towards project developers, ecosystem service providers, and so on and so forth. So far, so good. But the big question is, okay, fine, what are those natural capital assets in the first place, right? And I think it makes sense to briefly distinguish between assets that currently exist in the real world, the ones in green, essentially, and then in a second step, think about where can we actually move with tools that are provided by Web3 to improve those assets. This chart is also from a, let's say, DeFi protocol perspective, because it plots impact on the y-axis and liquidity on the x-axis, because liquidity is just so important in everything that you build in DeFi. You can probably start with, ownership of underlying assets. You could think of, essentially buying a piece of land to protect it from being cut down, a forest from being cut down. This is probably a high impact asset, but it's probably very, very illiquid because you essentially have to buy land, right? If you want to move into a more liquid direction, let's say you quickly end up in traditional climate finance instruments. So this might be like the private loans for, let's say, a solar development project, or even, slightly more publicly traded bonds, for example, issued by World Bank or other institutions. You are still in, let's say, a class of assets that are, from a DeFi perspective, difficult to handle. Most of those assets are considered, securities, so you have a lot of challenges in actually tokenizing them and working with them in a decentralized setup. Then there is a class of assets that I just described as ecological state change, but you can think of it for now as essentially carbon credits. So carbon credits is nothing else but like a ledger entry that verifies that a ton of CO2 has been removed from the air or not emitted into the air in the first place. And since this is just recorded in a database in the first place, this entry can also live on-chain and is a very, very liquid asset in a sense. And which is why at Mento we essentially started with this bottom, right bottom area of fairly liquid assets in that space. The question is then, like, how can we, where does Web3, help us here? I think there is a lot of potential of actually, and let's just stick with the example of carbon credits here, to actually improve on those assets. So a big problem with carbon credits, for example, is there's a huge time lag between project implementation and actually issuance of those credits, and then those credits are traded on the secondary and tertiary markets, and we trade essentially credits that represent activities that took place 10 years ago. So if we, through Web3 technology, can actually accelerate this process and make improvements and efficiency improvements in this monitoring and verification process, I think we can actually keep the, let's say, advantages of those fairly liquid assets, but actually improve in terms of impact quite a lot. On the other hand, there is probably a risk that by moving more into Web3 native assets, you lose on, let's say, trust and buy-in from institutional players in this market. And I think this is especially in markets that are still, not fairly developed, let's say the voluntary carbon market, actually a big risk. And so we should be a bit careful about, we shouldn't end up in the lower left corner. We should try to reach the upper right corner here. In general, over the last, let's say, 1 year that we've worked on this, we kind of found 4 areas that are challenging in that space. So whenever you deal with like real-world assets, you suddenly deal a lot with counterparty risk, right? You interact at some point in this process. You interact with counterparties. You have, from a protocol perspective, you have liquidity risk. There are a lot of legal challenges involved in this. I talk a lot with the legal team at Celo Foundation, for example, and more we realize that this is not really a technical challenge, but primarily a legal challenge. There is challenges around regulation, there's challenges around ownership, and the whole concept of how can a decentralized entity essentially own something in the real world in the first place. There are a couple of technical challenges as well. By pure definition, you integrate the off-chain world and the on-chain world, so you have integration problems, you make use of different kind of oracles that introduce new technical risks to this. And last but not least, I think we should also really be serious about the impact that is generated with those assets. And I think like the literature on theory of change can be maybe like a guiding principle here by focusing on plausibility. So let's say we, as some arbitrary DeFi protocol, include some asset. What does the asset actually do? How does it actually translate into action in the real world? On feasibility as well. So let's say we have this asset, is actually everything in place in the real world to generate the impact that we want to see? And last but not least, also measurability. So are there metrics in place? Is there something that we can track as like empirical observers on all of this? And I think, if done right, this can have a huge impact. I included this chart on CO2 emissions, but it doesn't really matter which chart you look at, because I think the message is quite clear, and I think the contribution that ReFi or Web3 more broadly can have here is quite substantial. So on the demand side, we can introduce like committed large-scale buyers into this space that stabilize like demand and create market opportunities for the entire supply chain. On the supply side, especially, we can support the launch of like new and innovative solutions at the intersection of like climate tech, climate finance, and Web3. And then there is like this meta component where I think DeFi really excels at, is like by providing market infrastructure and in increasing transparency and efficiency in this market. So that's just a very rough overview of how we think about this and what the challenges are that we see with this. I would very much like to discuss this with you in more detail. If you're interested, please feel free to check out the website mento.org or our Twitter or Discord, or yeah, just ping me if you're interested. Thanks a lot.
We have a few more minutes time, so in case there are any questions.
Yes, hi. I'm not sure you were there earlier, but I've just gotten in touch with the ReFi sector recently, so I'm still learning a lot. And one thing that I keep wondering about, so when you think about positive externalities, it's pretty easy to create a token and people want it, right? But when you talk about negative externalities, then the carbon market works partly because governments kind of coerce companies to do something about it, partly because the market or the customers want companies to do something about it, but it's kind of this coercion that needs to happen. So I've been wondering a lot whether there's ways to create incentives for these players that create negative externalities to voluntarily accept the cost of them and offset them.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question, and I think especially like climate finance in the ESG space, I think struggles with this for 20 years now or more. I think what we see now is essentially a moment in time where it's actually the customers that kind of dictate this, right? So there are studies that show that, for example, capital costs for companies that are not ESG compliant are actually higher than for compliant companies. And at that point in time, like you might even ask yourself, is this really still voluntary, like this participation in the carbon market, if it has like a tangible benefit? But I agree, maybe there are more direct mechanisms to like force them to do something. But I think even like the shift in consumer, attitudes and consumer demand already created something like a tangible channel, essentially, to create this feedback mechanism.
Hi, so if I understand you correctly, you're trying to tokenize natural resources to back up other currencies. And I'm wondering if, as long as governments or really big companies and enterprises are the ones that hold areas or all the technology that create this, let's say, the natural new technologies, so doesn't it compromise the decentralized character you're suggesting?
I mean, yes and no, I would say. It's the way I see it in a quite pragmatic way, I have to say. So, I mean, if we can kind of use the tools of, let's say, decentralized finance, and even if we, have to deal with like centralized entities somewhere in the real world, as long as it works, I'm good. In an ideal world, sure, this would be more open and more decentralized, but we're running out of time, essentially, and whatever works, essentially.
So it doesn't necessarily have to be integrated with Web3, or just an initiative to change a bit the economical system we're working on. Just tokenize some natural resources, as you suggest.
I think it's getting more and more integrated. So Sochi, I'm not sure if you were in her talk. She mentioned this team, Climate Collective, and there are like a lot of projects in there that actually work on providing this integration between like real world assets and turning them into something that is more Web3 native. But like this entire space is so new that I think it will simply take some more time, to be honest. Thank you.